The courtroom buzzed with a low murmur of anticipation as people filed into their seats, all eyes darting to the defendant standing by the bench. He was hard to miss, a tall, lean young man, barely out of his teens, with perfectly styled blonde hair that screamed luxury and privilege. Dressed in an oversized hoodie that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent, he seemed entirely out of place in the sterile, somber environment. Yet there he stood, clutching a sleek vape pen in one hand, as if he were at a house party rather than in front of a judge. Whispers floated around the room, people craning their necks to get a better look at the kid who had quickly become infamous after a video of his arrest went viral. The clip showed him smirking at the camera, flashing a peace sign as officers placed him in handcuffs. The charge? A mix of reckless behavior and entitlement, topped off with a sprinkle of absurdity. But it wasn't just his actions that landed him here. It was his attitude, the way he seemed to brush off every consequence as if it were beneath him. The judge, a seasoned professional known for his no-nonsense approach, entered the courtroom. He was the kind of man whose reputation preceded him, a stickler for rules, yet fair in his judgments. Today, though, there was something different in his demeanor. Perhaps it was the faint glimmer of curiosity in his eyes, or the way he glanced at the defendant, almost as if sizing him up. Everyone in the room felt it. This wasn't going to be an ordinary trial. The tension thickened as the judge called the session to order. All eyes were now fixed on the young man, who, to everyone's shock, casually raised the vape pen to his lips and took a long drag. A visible cloud of smoke drifted up, curling lazily under the fluorescent lights, and the room collectively gasped. The audacity was staggering. Even the bailiff looked stunned, his hand hovering near his holster as if unsure what to do next. The judge's gavel struck with a sharp crack, silencing the room. His expression remained unreadable, though his eyes seemed to burn with a mix of disbelief and something else, amusement perhaps. The defendant, meanwhile, appeared unfazed, exhaling slowly as if he were on a beach instead of facing potential jail time. "Young man," the judge finally said, his voice calm but firm, "do you have any idea where you are right now?" The defendant shrugged, his lips curling into a cocky grin. "Yeah, Your Honor. But like it's just a vape. Not a big deal, right?" The room froze, waiting for the judge's response. People leaned forward in their seats, the weight of the moment pressing down on them. Would he explode in anger, throw the book at him? Or was there something else in store, something no one could predict? The pause stretched endlessly, leaving everyone teetering on the edge of anticipation. And then the judge spoke. The judge let the moment hang in the air, his piercing gaze locked on the young man before him. The tension was almost unbearable, the courtroom so quiet that the faint hum of the air conditioning felt deafening. The young man, seemingly unbothered, shifted his weight and smirked again, clearly unshaken by the gravity of the situation, or maybe too clueless to understand it. The judge leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on the bench. "You seem to think this is a joke," he said, his voice calm but cutting, each word landing like a subtle warning. "But let me assure you, young man, this is far from amusing." For a moment, the smirk wavered. Just a flicker of doubt crossed the young man's face before he masked it with an exaggerated shrug. "I don't know what the big deal is," he said, dragging out his words lazily. "It's not like I hurt anyone. You're making this dramatic." A murmur swept through the courtroom, an undercurrent of disbelief mixed with frustration. From the gallery, a middle-aged woman, dressed sharply in a navy blazer, buried her face in her hands. Her perfectly manicured nails pressed against her temples as if trying to block out the spectacle unfolding before her. She was his mother, of course, the one who had hired a high-powered lawyer to defend her son. That lawyer, a polished man with salt and pepper hair, sat stiffly at the defense table, his expression unreadable but his jaw visibly clenched. He hadn't said a word yet, perhaps hoping the less his client spoke, the better. The judge straightened in his chair, his presence commanding the room effortlessly. "Let's start from the beginning," he said, his tone measured but firm. "Because I'm struggling to understand how a young man like you, who clearly has every advantage in life, ends up standing in front of me, acting as though none of this matters. So enlighten me. What led you here?" The defendant leaned back slightly, as if weighing how much he cared to explain. "It's not that deep, Your Honor," he began, his voice carrying that unmistakable edge of entitlement. "I was at a party. Things got a little wild, sure. But I wasn't the only one doing stuff, you know. People always want to single me out because of who I am." "And who are you?" The judge interrupted, his tone sharp. The question sliced through the young man's bravado, forcing him to pause. The courtroom was silent, the question hanging in the air like a challenge. The young man hesitated, then shrugged again, his grin faltering. "I mean, I'm just me," he said, but the confidence in his voice had wavered ever so slightly. "People always want to judge me before they even know me." The judge leaned back, his expression unreadable. "And do you think this behavior helps people see you differently? Do you think flaunting your disregard for the law and this courtroom paints you in a better light?" The young man didn't answer right away. He glanced around the room, his eyes briefly meeting his mother's before darting away. Her face was a mix of anger, embarrassment, and something else, perhaps exhaustion. The kind of exhaustion that comes from years of excuses and second chances. As the silence stretched on, the judge shifted his focus. "Let's get some context," he said, addressing the prosecution. "What exactly happened the night of his arrest?" The prosecutor, a no-nonsense woman with sharp eyes and a stack of neatly organized files, stood up. She spoke clearly, her voice cutting through the tension like a knife. "Your Honor, on the night in question, the defendant was attending an event at a private residence. The party got out of hand. Noise complaints, reports of underage drinking, and suspected drug use. When law enforcement arrived, the defendant was found on the roof of the property, vaping and encouraging others to join him, despite officers repeatedly asking him to come down. He refused, stating, and I quote, 'What are you gonna do, arrest me?'" A few quiet gasps rippled through the gallery. The young man rolled his eyes, muttering something under his breath, but the prosecutor continued unfazed. Officers attempted to de-escalate the situation, but the defendant's behavior grew increasingly belligerent. When they finally managed to get him down, he was uncooperative and verbally abusive, claiming that his family's influence would make all of this go away. The judge's eyes flicked back to the young man, who now looked decidedly less cocky. His mother shifted uncomfortably in her seat, her lips pressed into a thin line. The prosecutor continued, "This isn't the first time the defendant has been in trouble with the law. There are prior incidents, public disturbances, reckless driving, and even a previous warning for possession of controlled substances. Each time he's walked away with minimal consequences, thanks to his family's resources." The weight of her words hung heavily in the room. The judge let them sink in before turning his attention back to the defendant. "Is that true?" he asked, his voice calm but laced with steel. "Have you been given second chances before?" The young man hesitated, then mumbled, "Yeah, I guess." The judge leaned forward, his gaze unrelenting. "And yet here you are again. Why do you think that is?" The question hung in the air, and for the first time the young man didn't have a quick answer. His usual swagger seemed to falter under the weight of the judge's scrutiny. He shifted uncomfortably, his hands fidgeting with the hem of his hoodie. Before he could respond, the judge added, "Privilege doesn't exempt you from accountability, young man. If anything, it demands more from you. You've been given opportunities that many people can only dream of. And what have you done with them?" The room was silent, the gravity of the judge's words sinking in. Even the young man's lawyer looked affected, his usually stoic expression softening ever so slightly. The judge leaned back, his eyes still locked on the defendant. "Here's the thing," he said, his tone quieter now but no less firm. "This isn't just about you. Your actions have ripple effects. They affect your family, your community, and the people who look up to you, if anyone still does. So I'm going to ask you one last time, why do you think you're standing here today?" The young man opened his mouth to respond, but the words seemed to catch in his throat. For the first time, he looked uncertain, even vulnerable. The courtroom watched in silence, waiting to see what he would say. And then, as if on cue, the judge leaned forward again, his voice low and deliberate. "Take your time," he said, "because how you answer this question might just determine what happens next." The young man's eyes darted to the floor, avoiding the judge's penetrating gaze. The courtroom was still, the silence broken only by the faint sound of papers shuffling as the court reporter recorded every word and gesture. For a moment, it looked like he might actually answer, but then he sighed and leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms defiantly. "I don't know," he muttered. "Maybe I'm here because everyone's out to get me." A few people in the gallery exchanged incredulous looks, while the prosecutor pressed her lips into a tight line, clearly holding back a retort. The judge's expression didn't change, but his eyes seemed to narrow slightly, as if trying to see through the layers of arrogance and excuses to something deeper beneath. "Out to get you," the judge repeated slowly. "Do you really believe that? Or is that just easier to say than admitting your choices brought you here?" The young man didn't answer, his jaw tightening as he stared at the spot on the table in front of him. The tension in the room thickened, and his mother shifted uncomfortably in her seat. For the first time, she raised her hand slightly, as if signaling to her son to stop talking before he dug himself any deeper. He didn't notice, or maybe he chose to ignore her. Meanwhile, the defense attorney finally leaned forward, clearing his throat. "Your Honor," he began carefully, his voice measured and calm. "If I may, my client is a young man who, like many his age, sometimes struggles to fully grasp the consequences of his actions. While his behavior that night was regrettable, it's important to remember that he's still learning and growing." The judge raised an eyebrow, cutting the attorney off with a subtle gesture. "Learning and growing," he repeated, his tone neutral but his words heavy with implication. "And how many more opportunities does he need to learn before he understands the weight of his actions? Because from where I'm sitting, it seems he's been given more chances than most." The defense attorney hesitated, clearly weighing his next words carefully. "Your Honor," he said finally, "I believe this could be a valuable teaching moment for my client, a chance to reflect on his actions and make meaningful changes moving forward." The judge's gaze flicked back to the defendant, who still sat slouched in his chair, his expression a mix of boredom and irritation. "Is that what you want?" the judge asked, addressing him directly. "A chance to change? Or are you content with this pattern, living recklessly and expecting the world to clean up your messes?" The question hung in the air, and for the first time, a flicker of something, maybe doubt, maybe fear, crossed the young man's face. But before he could answer, the judge continued. "Because here's the thing," he said, his voice firm. "Life won't always protect you from the consequences of your choices. There will come a time when no lawyer, no parent, no amount of money can shield you. And if you don't figure that out now, the next time you stand in a courtroom like this, the stakes might be a lot higher." The young man shifted uncomfortably, his bravado cracking just enough for the room to see a glimpse of vulnerability. But the moment was fleeting, and he quickly masked it with another shrug. "I guess," he muttered under his breath, barely audible. The judge studied him for a long moment, then turned his attention to the prosecutor. "What's the state's position on sentencing?" he asked, his tone all business. The prosecutor stood again, her expression serious. "Your Honor, given the defendant's repeated offenses and his apparent lack of remorse, the state believes a stricter sentence is necessary. Probation alone has proven ineffective in deterring his behavior. We would recommend a combination of community service, mandatory counseling, and a short custodial sentence to impress upon him the seriousness of his actions." A low murmur rippled through the gallery, and the young man's head snapped up, his eyes wide with panic. "Wait, custodial sentence?" he blurted out. "Like jail? Are you serious?" The judge's gavel came down sharply, silencing the room. "Mr. Harper," he said, addressing the defendant by his last name for the first time, "you would do well to remain quiet while others are speaking. You've had plenty of time to explain yourself, and what you've chosen to say, or not say, speaks volumes." The young man's face flushed, but he clamped his mouth shut, his knuckles whitening as he gripped the edges of the table. His mother, who had been sitting quietly up until now, suddenly stood. "Your Honor," she said, her voice trembling slightly, "if I may." The judge gestured for her to continue, and she stepped forward hesitantly, her heels clicking against the tiled floor. "I know my son has made mistakes," she began, her voice shaking with a mix of emotion and determination. "And I take responsibility for some of that. Maybe I protected him too much or didn't push him hard enough to face the consequences of his actions. But please, Your Honor, he's not a bad person. He needs help." Her words hung in the air, raw and unguarded, and for a moment, even the prosecutor seemed to soften. The judge listened intently, his expression unreadable, and when she finished, he nodded once. "Mrs. Harper," he said, his tone gentler than had been with her son, "I appreciate your honesty. But part of helping someone is knowing when to step back and let them face the consequences of their actions. Protecting him from accountability won't serve him in the long run." She nodded quickly, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue, and returned to her seat. The judge turned his attention back to the defendant, who looked more subdued than he had all day. "Mr. Harper," the judge said, his voice firm but not unkind, "I want you to think about everything that's been said here today. Not just by me, but by your mother, by the prosecutor, by your own lawyer. Because the decision I make won't just impact you, it will impact everyone around you. And whether you like it or not, you have a responsibility to them, as well as to yourself." The young man nodded reluctantly, his bravado finally stripped away, leaving only the barest hint of the person underneath. But what that person truly was, or could become, remained an unanswered question. The judge leaned back, his expression thoughtful. I'll take everything I've heard today into consideration before making my decision. Court is adjourned." The gavel came down one final time, and the room erupted into whispers and murmurs. But even as the crowd began to disperse, the weight of the unresolved tension lingered, heavy and unrelenting. As the courtroom emptied, the young man, still visibly shaken, stayed seated. His lawyer leaned in, speaking in low, measured tones, but whatever advice he was offering seemed to go unheard. The defendant stared blankly ahead, his usually sharp, cocky demeanor completely absent. His mother approached cautiously, her heels clicking softly on the tile floor, and placed a hand on his shoulder. He didn't look up. "Come on," she said gently, trying to mask the strain in her voice. "Let's go home." He finally stood, but his movements were sluggish, like someone dragging a weight behind them. As they walked toward the exit, the prosecutor watched them from across the room, her expression unreadable. Even she seemed to sense that something about this case felt different, heavier than the others she handled. There was something deeply unsettling about the boy's hollow stare, the way he seemed to teeter on the edge of realizing just how much trouble he was truly in. Outside, the air was brisk, the city buzzing with its usual chaos. Reporters swarmed the courthouse steps, their cameras flashing as microphones were shoved into their faces. The young man's lawyer quickly stepped in, shielding him and his mother from the barrage of questions. "Do you think the judge will make an example of you?" "Any comments on the prosecutor's request for jail time? What do you say to the people who claim you've gotten away with too much already?" The young man didn't respond, his head bowed as he climbed into the sleek black car waiting at the curb. His mother followed, giving the crowd a tight, forced smile before disappearing into the vehicle. As the car pulled away, the young man leaned his head against the window, watching the world blur past him. For the first time, it felt like the bubble he'd lived in his entire life might finally have burst. That evening, the tension in a sprawling, meticulously decorated home was unbearable. His mother paced the living room, her phone in hand, while his father, usually absent from these kinds of crises, sat silently in an armchair, his fingers steepled. The young man sat on the couch, staring blankly at the television, which was playing a news segment about his case. His own face stared back at him from the screen, the headlines scrolling beneath: "Rich teen faces potential jail time after public outrage over arrest." "Turn that off," his mother snapped, her voice sharp with anxiety. He grabbed the remote and muted it instead, still watching as the reporters dissected every aspect of his life, his family's wealth, his previous arrests, his social media antics. They played clips from the viral video of his rooftop stunt, his smirk frozen in time as he taunted the officers below. The commentators debated whether the judge would go easy on him or finally make an example of him. "You have to take this seriously," his father said, breaking his silence. His voice was low, almost menacing, the kind of tone that brooked no argument. "This isn't something we can just fix with money." The young man finally turned away from the screen, his expression hardening. "I'm taking it seriously," he shot back, though the defensive edge in his voice made it clear he wasn't entirely convinced of his own words. "It's not like I asked for any of this." His father's eyes narrowed, his jaw tightening. "You didn't ask for it," he repeated, his voice rising slightly. "You're the one who climbed onto that roof. You're the one who refused to come down. You're the one who thought you were untouchable." "That's enough," his mother interjected, her voice sharp but wavering. She looked at her son, her expression softening. "We need to focus on what's next. The judge hasn't made a decision yet, and we still have time to show that you're willing to take responsibility." He scoffed, leaning back against the couch. "Responsibility? Isn't that what we pay lawyers for?" The room fell into a heavy silence, his parents exchanging a look that was equal parts frustration and despair. For all their efforts to shield him from the consequences of his actions, it was clear that they were starting to wonder if they'd done him more harm than good. The next day, the young man was summoned back to court for the final decision. The air inside the courtroom felt electric, charged with anticipation and uncertainty. The gallery was packed, reporters lining the back wall, while members of the public whispered among themselves, their eyes fixed on the defendant as he took his seat. The judge entered and the room fell silent. His expression was stern, but there was a hint of something else in his gaze, something almost like disappointment. He wasted no time, his voice cutting through the stillness as he addressed the young man directly. "Mr. Harper," he began, his tone measured but firm. "Over the past few days, I've reviewed every aspect of this case. I considered the evidence, your history, and the statements from all parties involved. And while I'd like to believe you have the potential to change, your actions and your attitude have made it difficult for me to trust that you're ready to take that step. The young man swallowed hard, his hands gripping the edges of the table in front of him. His lawyer placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder, but the gesture did little to ease the tension radiating off him. "This is your opportunity to prove me wrong," the judge continued, his voice heavy with meaning. "But it's up to you whether you take it or squander it. The choice and the consequences are yours to bear." The judge paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. The room was so silent that even the faint scratch of the court reporter's pen seemed deafening. Everyone leaned forward, holding their breath as they waited for the verdict. The judge's pause felt endless, stretching the tension so tightly that it felt like the room itself might snap under the weight. The young man's jaw clenched, his fingers drumming nervously on the table. For the first time, the reality of the situation seemed to truly dawn on him. He wasn't untouchable. This wasn't a game, and the stakes had never been higher. Then the judge leaned forward, his voice steady but unyielding. "Given the circumstances," he began, "and your apparent lack of remorse, I have little choice but to hold you accountable in a way that ensures you understand the gravity of your actions." However, he paused again, and the word hung in the air like a lifeline, making everyone sit up a little straighter. "There's something I've learned that changes the context of this case." The room collectively froze, every ear straining to catch the judge's next words. The young man exchanged a quick, confused glance with his lawyer, his mind racing. What could the judge possibly mean? The judge continued, his tone growing sharper. "Late last night, additional evidence was brought to my attention. Evidence that you were not only warned multiple times to leave the rooftop, but also that you've actively encouraged several younger individuals to join you. Individuals who looked up to you and followed your example despite the obvious danger." A ripple of murmurs spread through the gallery, and the young man's face went pale. "What?" he blurted out, his voice shaky. "That's not true. I didn't tell anyone to." The judge's gavel came down sharply, silencing him. "You will not interrupt me, Mr. Harper," he said, his voice like ice. "This isn't a debate." The young man's lawyer leaned in, whispering furiously in his ear, but whatever reassurance or strategy he offered seemed to bounce off the rising tide of panic that gripped his client. The young man's mind reeled. He hadn't thought twice about the group of teenagers who had followed his lead that night, climbing onto the roof and vaping alongside him. To him, it had been a stupid party stunt, nothing more. But now, hearing it framed this way, encouraging younger individuals, it suddenly sounded so much worse. The judge gestured to the prosecutor, who stood and addressed the court. "Your Honor, as part of our investigation, we obtained testimony from 2 minors who were present at the party. They stated that the defendant not only encouraged them to climb onto the roof, but also mocked those who refused, calling them boring and weak. One of these individuals nearly slipped while attempting to climb down, an incident that could have resulted in severe injury or worse." Gasps rippled through the gallery, and the young man's mother clutched her chest as if she'd been physically struck. His father sat rigidly, his face a mask of controlled fury. The young man shook his head, his voice rising in protest. "That's not what happened. I didn't make any own." "Enough," the judge barked, his voice cutting through the chaos like a blade. "This isn't the time for excuses. This is the time to face the reality of your actions." The young man slumped back in his chair, his face a mixture of shock and desperation. His lawyer's jaw was tight, his carefully laid defense now unraveling in real time. The stakes had just been raised to a level no one in the room had anticipated. But the surprises weren't over. Just as the judge was about to continue, the doors at the back of the courtroom creaked open, drawing everyone's attention. A young woman stepped inside, clutching a folder tightly against her chest. She looked nervous but determined, her eyes scanning the room until they landed on the judge. "Your Honor," she said, her voice trembling slightly, "I have something that might change everything." The gallery erupted into whispers, and even the judge looked taken aback by the interruption. "And you are?" he asked, his tone wary. "My name is Rachel," she said, her voice gaining strength. "I was at the party that night, and I think you need to see this." She approached the bench, handing the folder to the bailiff, who passed it to the judge. As he opened it, his expression shifted, first to confusion, then to something unreadable. He flipped through the contents quickly, his eyes scanning the pages with increasing intensity. The young man stared at Rachel, his mind racing. He didn't recognize her, but there was something in her determined gaze that unsettled him. His lawyer leaned over and whispered, "Who is she? Do you know her?" "No," he muttered, shaking his head. "I don't." The judge finally closed the folder and looked up, his expression unreadable. "This evidence raises some serious questions," he said slowly, addressing both the prosecution and defense. "Questions that will need to be answered before I can make a final ruling." "What does it say?" the young man blurted out, unable to stop himself. The judge didn't answer directly, his gaze fixed firmly on the defendant. Let's just say it paints a much clearer picture of what happened that night, and who was really at fault. The young man's stomach dropped, the weight of those words pressing down on him like a stone. He glanced at Rachel again, her calm, unyielding presence only adding to his growing sense of dread. Whatever was in that folder, it was clear that it wasn't in his favor. And as the judge adjourned the court, leaving everyone to speculate on the new evidence, one thing became painfully clear. The story was far from over, and the truth was only just beginning to surface.